Imagine being able to boost your child's chances of getting into a top university way before they even, start school.
It sounds like sci-fi.
It really does. But today on the deep dive, we're looking at some, fascinating new research. It explores how people in Singapore are thinking about using technology to potentially enhance their kids' intelligence.
Exactly. We're diving into a recent study that polled Singaporeans on their attitudes towards what they call reprogenetic technologies.
Reprogenetic, okay.
Yes, specifically polygenic embryo selection, that's PES, and gene editing.
Right.
These are techniques that could, theoretically, make it more likely for a child to have certain traits. Things like, a predisposition towards higher cognitive abilities.
Which could mean better chances at academic success, I suppose.
That's the idea. And the study also looked at more, shall we say, traditional methods, too, like SAT prep courses.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Polygenic embryo selection, gene editing, it still feels pretty futuristic.
It does.
So PES, that's where you analyze several embryos made through IVF, right? And pick the one with the best probability for a certain trait based on lots of genes working together.
Precisely. You're selecting from the possibilities. Gene editing, though, that's different. It allows for actual precise changes to the DNA sequence itself in the embryo.
Okay, got it. Selecting versus changing.
But, this isn't just about the tech itself. Our sources also give us some really important context. Things like the history of eugenics in that region.
Singapore and Malaysia, yeah.
And also raising those big questions about, who can actually afford this stuff? Access is key.
Definitely. So our mission for this deep dive is really to get a handle on what this Singapore study found. What do people actually think?
And then explore the why behind it, the cultural factors. Why might Singaporeans specifically feel this way?
And finally, consider the bigger picture, the societal implications, fairness, equity, what this means for human development down the line.
Especially relevant in a place like Singapore, as you said, with its unique history and cultural values. We'll definitely get into that.
Okay, so let's get straight to it then. What were the big takeaways from the Singapore study, the key findings on attitudes?
Well, overall, the study showed a pretty considerable willingness among Singaporeans to think about interventions, specifically to boost their kids' chances of getting into a top 100 university.
Okay, and the specific methods.
Right, so looking at specifics, 71% supported SAT prep courses, which, as you mentioned, isn't a huge shock. That's pretty established.
Yeah, standard practice for many, I'd imagine. But what about the newer technologies, PES and gene editing?
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting. They found 57% of people were open to polygenic embryo selection, PES.
Over half.
And even gene editing, actually altering the code, had a 48% acceptance rate, nearly half.
Okay, those numbers are quite high.
Yeah.
A majority for selection, almost half for editing genes. Were there differences? Did everyone feel this way?
No, there were some definite patterns. The study found that people with university degrees were actually 8 to 9 percentage points less likely to want to use embryo selection or gene editing.
Huh. That's counterintuitive, maybe. You'd think more education equals more openness to tech.
Well, the study authors suggest maybe higher education means more awareness of the societal complexities. So more caution.
I see. Makes sense. What about religious individuals?
They also showed lower support, especially for gene editing, which kind of aligns with many faiths being cautious about, directly manipulating the genome for enhancement.
Okay. And the study mentioned ethnic differences too, didn't it, within Singapore?
It did, absolutely. Malay respondents showed the highest support for PES, for polygenic embryo selection. That was 70%.
70%? That's very high.
Very high. But conversely, the Chinese respondents were the most open to gene editing, at 50%.
Those are quite clear differences. Did the study guess why?
It did. And this is where the cultural context part comes in. A really key finding was about the perceived morality. People saw PES as much less morally wrong than gene editing.
How much less?
Only 20% saw PS for educational goals as morally wrong. But for gene editing, that number jumped to 31%.
Okay, so why? Why the difference in judging the morality if the goal is sort of similar? Boosting chances.
The authors think it's about how the tech is understood. PES is seen as, picking from what's already naturally there in the IVF process. Like choosing the best ticket in a genetic lottery. You're not fundamentally changing anything, just selecting.
Right, whereas gene editing...
Gene editing is seen as making direct changes, actively altering the genetic material. And that feels like a bigger step, maybe tampering with nature for a larger chunk of people.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. Selecting versus changing. Did they compare these attitudes to anywhere else? The U.S., maybe?
Yes, they did. Compared to a similar U.S. study, Singaporeans showed, well, significantly greater moral acceptance and willingness to use all three PS, gene editing, and SAT prep for university admission chances.
Really underlines the cultural factor, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It strongly suggests culture plays a huge role in shaping these views.
So let's dig into that cultural context more, the why behind these Singapore numbers. What did the authors point to?
They really highlighted the influence of Confucian values, which are quite strong in Singapore and, many East Asian cultures.
And what does that entail in this context?
Well, these values put a huge emphasis on hard work, on education as the key path to, getting ahead, social mobility.
Right.
There's a strong drive for good jobs, financial security, and also this sense of family obligation, supporting future generations. Education is just central to all of that.
We often hear the term tiger parenting linked to education in that part of the world. Does that fit here?
Oh, definitely. The authors mention it. That idea of really intensive, achievement-focused parenting, putting huge emphasis on academics, extracurriculars, anything to boost educational success. It's particularly common among the Chinese population there.
So that intense focus could make people more open to tech that promises an edge.
It seems like a contributing factor, yes. A cultural environment that prizes educational success so highly might naturally be more receptive to considering these kinds of enhancements.
What about the ethnic differences, though? We saw Malays had really high support for peace, 70%. Any thoughts on why?
That's a really interesting point. The study suggests this might be linked to their status as an ethnic minority group in Singapore.
Ah, okay.
They might see peace as a potential tool,
Yeah.
a way to perhaps level the playing field for their children's future opportunities, maybe help overcome some disadvantages in that very competitive environment for university and jobs.
Using tech to try and bridge a gap, potentially?
Potentially. And interestingly, the sources sort of hint, and this is delicate, that historical discussions in the region about group-level hereditary traits might subtly feed into current thinking about improving future generations. But that's speculative.
Something to think about. But didn't the study also say Malays had lower support for gene editing?
Yes, exactly. And for that, religious belief seems key. Most Malays in Singapore are Muslim, and Islamic teachings generally view gene editing for enhancement as problematic, as altering God's creation.
I see.
But P, since it's just selecting from natural combinations, might be seen as more acceptable within that framework. Less direct alteration.
Okay, so we're seeing this real interplay of cultural values, minority status, religious beliefs, all shaping how these technologies are perceived.
It's incredibly complex.
Now let's shift gears a bit to the history. Our sources mentioned past eugenics movements in Singapore and Malaysia. How does that history inform this current situation?
Yeah, that historical context is, it's pretty crucial. Singapore's first prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew, had very strong ideas about genetics and intelligence.
Right, I remember reading about that.
In the 1980s, his government actually launched a pretty explicit eugenics campaign. The goal was to get women with more education to have more kids and women with less education to have fewer.
Wow, that's very direct. What did they actually do?
Oh, there were big public awareness campaigns, TV shows pushing the idea. They offered money. Incentives for less educated people with few kids to get sterilized.
Seriously, sterilization incentives.
Yes. And they set up a matchmaking service for graduates. And maybe the most controversial bit, kids of graduate mothers with 3 or more children got priority for school places.
That school access part sounds like it would cause uproar. Did it?
It absolutely did. Huge public backlash. Even the media, usually quite aligned with the government, printed critical letters. People in Lee Kuan Yew's own party spoke out against it.
So what happened?
Well, essentially, this very top-down social engineering attempt. It failed. It was too unpopular, and many of the more coercive policies got rolled back.
So even in Singapore's unique political system, these overt, unequal policies were rejected. That's important.
It really is, and it sets up a fascinating contrast with the new study, doesn't it? Direct state-led eugenics was unacceptable, but maybe elective enhancement, chosen by individuals using new tech, that seems potentially more palatable to the public now.
That's a critical distinction. What about Malaysia? The sources mentioned leaders there having similar ideas.
Yes, Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's long-serving prime minister. He also wrote about heredity quite explicitly. In his book, The Malay Dilemma, he argued hereditary factors were significant in how different racial groups developed. He even suggested some economic disadvantages faced by Malays were tied to their cultural genetic evolutionary history, contrasting them with the Chinese population. He also mentioned inbreeding, consanguineous marriage, as a possible factor.
So leaders in both countries were thinking about inherent group differences linked to heredity. How might that connect to today's high support for peace among Malays in Singapore?
Again, we have to be careful. But the sources raise the possibility that this historical focus on group traits might somehow subtly influence the current thinking. This idea of proactively improving the next generation's potential. Maybe it resonates partly because of those older underlying ideas about group characteristics.
It's a bit unsettling to think how past ideas about heredity might linger as we face these new technologies. Okay, let's pivot to a huge issue. Inequality. Who gets access and what happens then?
Yes, this is where the really big ethical alarms start ringing. The consensus among experts seems to be that this kind of reprogenetic cognitive enhancement, it's likely going to be very expensive.
Why so expensive?
Well, you've got massive R&D costs, companies needing to make back their investment, patents, plus the procedures themselves are complex. Sophisticated lab work, surgeries, you need highly skilled people. It's labor intensive.
The source material used some analogies, saying it might not get cheaper like phones or computers did.
Exactly. It contrasted it with, say, dental implants. The implant itself might get cheaper, but the complex work by the specialist dentist, that stays expensive, even goes up. These reprogenetic techs, being so personalized and skill-dependent, might follow that pattern more than the mass-market tech pattern.
Right. So probably not getting cheap anytime soon. What about government stepping in? Subsidies to make it fair?
Seems unlikely, according to the sources. The costs would be huge for the state, and politically. It's tough to argue for spending public money on enhancement rather than essential health care or treating diseases.
Okay, so if it's expensive and probably not subsidized, what are the consequences, especially in a diverse place like Singapore?
The biggest worry is making existing inequalities way worse. Social and economic gaps. If only the wealthy can afford cognitive enhancement, it could create even bigger divides, potentially further marginalizing groups that already face disadvantages.
And the inequality might not just be between different groups in society, right? The source mentioned issues within families, too.
That's a really important and maybe overlooked point. High costs could mean parents can only afford it for, say, their later children, not the first ones.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Imagine the resentment, the jealousy between siblings. That could create real unfairness and conflict right inside the family unit.
That paints a potentially difficult picture. Beyond Singapore, the source also mentioned this idea of gene culture coevolution and how tech might affect different societies differently.
Yes, that's a profound idea. Gene culture coevolution is this ongoing dance between our genes and our culture, each influencing the other over time.
Okay.
Well, adopting these powerful reprogenetic technologies could massively speed up or hypercharge that process. And because different societies have different values, ethics, laws, they might adopt these techs differently. Potentially leading to quite different evolutionary paths for different societies. Some might embrace enhancement, others might restrict it heavily.
The source gave examples, didn't it? Israel and Germany.
It did. Israel, with its focus on national continuity and tackling genetic diseases, common in some groups, has what's called technonatalism. High IVF rates, lots of genetic testing. Germany, because of its history, is much more cautious, stricter rules.
Very different approaches based on culture and history.
Exactly. And this also brings up medical tourism. People from strict countries traveling to places with looser laws for these procedures, which, again, brings us back to global inequality of access.
So we could end up with not just unequal individuals, but entire societies diverging based on how they handle this technology. That's a lot to take in.
It really is. It forces us to ask some fundamental questions about what we value, what's fair, and what kind of future we're actually building.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the Singapore study and everything around it?
Okay, first, Singaporeans show, well, a notably higher acceptance of using these reprogenetic technologies, PES and gene editing, for cognitive enhancement compared to Americans.
Right, likely linked to cultural values.
Exactly. That strong emphasis on education, achievement, getting ahead. Second, while those past overt eugenics attempts in Singapore failed, because of public pushback.
Mm-hmm.
These newer elective technologies seem to be viewed differently, perhaps more acceptably. But,
But, and this is crucial, there are huge concerns about access. These techs will likely be expensive, and that risks making existing social and economic divides much, much wider, both within societies and potentially between different countries globally.
so we've looked at the potential upsides, the history, the serious risks of inequality. It really leaves us with a big question for our listeners, doesn't it?
It does.
Given all this, the potential benefits, the risks, the cultural influences, how should we as societies navigate these growing powers to shape the genetics of the next generation?
Mm-hmm.
Is that idea of the genetic lottery really being phased out?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is, what are the consequences? Yeah, we'd encourage everyone listening to think more about the ethics, the societal impact of cognitive enhancement. Consider that complex dance between culture and genetics. How do your own cultural values shape how you see these powerful, fast-developing technologies? It's definitely a conversation we all need to be having.